West London, where we can speak now to the Cabinet Office Minister, one of the people leading the government's response, Michael Gove. Thank you very much for being on the programme today. There have been reports over the weekend that the government has drawn up a three-stage plan for ending the lockdown, which includes potentially opening schools from the 11th of May, some non-essential retail businesses, and then allowing small gatherings by the end of the month. Now, of course, I know there are huge caveats here. Nothing has been decided. But is that correct?
No, it's not. It is the case that we are looking at all of the evidence, but we've set some tests which need to be passed before we can think of easing restrictions in this lockdown. It's very important when we're still in the process of making sure that we can reduce the rate of infection and also reduce the number of deaths, that we maintain the steps that we have. Now, of course, we're looking at the data. It is the case that the rate of infection appears to be flattening, but we do not want to take steps too early, because the most important thing is to make sure that the NHS and the public's health is protected.
You can tell that people agree with that assessment. That's why so many people are obeying the lockdown, staying at home to try and protect the NHS. But if we're looking at a kind of roadmap, if you like, out of the lockdown, which many people would like to see, it's been a difficult period for many people already. Is it right, the broad brush direction, for example, that schools and nurseries may be one of the earliest things to open?
No, I think it would be wrong to get ahead of ourselves here. It is the case that if we manage to ensure that the rate of infection is kept low, if we can see the rate of deaths falling, if we can make sure that the NHS's capacity is as strong as it can be, then we can think about some of the steps we may be able to take in order to release some of the restrictions that are already in place. But the important thing is that we're guided, as we have been throughout, by the facts and by the scientific advice that we receive. And the facts and the advice are clear at the moment that we should not be thinking of lifting these restrictions yet.
Clearly coming through that the timing of this is something that is still being looked at, that nothing is going to change yet. But is it not fair to say what could change, even if you can't say when it would change? People are smart enough to realise that they have to stay home now, but they may look to asking the government about what the plan is in a few weeks' time or a few months' time.
It's entirely understandable, of course, that there should be a public debate about how we approach these difficult choices. But the most important thing to do is to make sure that we proceed in a way that's guided by science. And one of the things that we need to have are all the facts, all the data in front of us to know what would be appropriate to do and at what time. So the steps that we've introduced have been determined by the advice that we've received from the Government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. And they and others are looking at the facts that we have now. And it's on the basis of those facts that we will then say what we believe is the right process and the right timescale for easing these restrictions. And I appreciate, obviously, that if we're thinking in due course of particular settings coming back and operating, we need to make sure that those settings have time to prepare. Absolutely. But it is also the case that we need to make sure that when those settings do come back, whatever the appropriate area of our life, our public life it is that has the restrictions eased, it's also important that we bear in mind what the new situation might be in those settings, because one of the things that we've learned from this new and deadly virus is that after we ease restrictions in some areas, there will still be a need for discipline in others, and we need to make sure that the approach that we take is informed by the science, and that the measures on social distancing and on protecting individuals, particularly public sector workers, are appropriate.
Talking about being guided by the evidence and the science, the number of people dying is still breathtakingly high, of course. But are you hopeful that we may be past the peak?
Well, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that is deeply worrying and concerning is still the high level of deaths. And as you've reported and recorded, and as we know, every single death is the loss of a loved one and will cause grief and heartache for families across the country. And it's precisely for that reason that we don't want to lift restrictions before we can be confident that we're in a position where it's safe to do so. Now, the evidence suggests that the rate of infection and the death rate is flattening, but we're not absolutely certain that we are yet on a downward trajectory. And we want to be heading towards that downward trajectory to be confident about all the steps that we might want to take.
I want to ask you about the Prime Minister, who, of course, is still recovering at Chequers. How is he? And is he going to be doing any work in the coming weeks?
Well, the Prime Minister's recovering well. He's in cheerful spirits, and he had the opportunity to talk to Dominic Raab, his deputy, the First Secretary of State, on Friday, and the Prime Minister's instructions to the rest of us in government were communicated by the First Secretary of State when we had a conference call yesterday morning. So it's good that the Prime Minister is recovering. He's following, of course, the advice of his doctors in order to make sure that he rests, recovers fully, but he's absolutely on top of things, and it's I think the wish of all of us that the Prime Minister is restored to full health as quickly as possible.
Now, I'm keen to move on to some of the criticisms of the government response to COVID-19.